Hello, I'm Danielle Bochove. I'm Bloomberg's Toronto bureau chief, and I'm joined by Nik Nanos. He is chief data scientist at Nanos Research. Thanks very much, Nik, for making some time for us today.
Great to join you.
I know that last month we're going to look at the energy transition in Canada as sort of the main subject for today's talk. Last month, Germany's chancellor and vice chancellor came to Canada to ask for Canada's help dealing with the European energy crisis. And I gather that you were in some of those talks, invited to some of the private events. And I wanted to start by just asking, first of all, about your impressions.
Well, it's quite interesting. First of all, it's very clear that the Germans are looking for energy partners around the world. And they're the energy partners that they'd like to have, and then the energy partners they will likely end up having. And, Canada's at the very top of the list as a country that Germans would like to buy energy from. But what's clear from at least the discussions that I was part of, and is that, for the Germans, what they need immediately is LNG. And the other thing that's clear is that Canada is an unlikely direct supplier of LNG to Germany. But what was interesting in some of the discussions, at least that I was part of, one of the things that the Germans did ask was for the Canadians, because there is a pipeline in the West Coast, one of the best things that they could do to help Germany would be to export LNG out west in order to alleviate some of the pressure on the global supply of LNG.
Well, and of course, the big announcement that came out of those meetings was the East Coast hydrogen deal. And obviously, that's further out on the horizon, but I am curious about how that deal sort of stacked up, I guess, against the starting positions of both the governments, to your knowledge.
Well, what's clear is that the Germans not only want hydrogen, they want clean and green hydrogen. That's their top priority.
Right. But which means you have to make it with hydro or renewable energy.
Absolutely. But the reality is that the time horizon to produce something like that and the energy, the renewable energy that would be required is actually quite significant. So that particular announcement is probably more of a long-term play. And that there's probably a greater reality of what I'll say in the great rainbow of hydrogen, blue hydrogen potentially. But that was much more of a long-term play, basically for Canada and Germany to collaborate on moving forward on that front. And, the other thing that was interesting had to do with critical minerals. The big automakers were there, Mercedes, Volkswagen. It's pretty clear they have a lot of appetite on the battery front and see Canada probably as a more practical and immediate partner on critical minerals in order to help that sector.
All of these conversations seem to take a sort of a similar direction in that everyone likes to talk about the opportunity for Canada. And I'm glad you brought up critical minerals because that's one of them. Hydrogen, I think, is the other one that gets mentioned all the time. The country has obviously enormous hydro and renewable potential. The question seems to be whether or not we can move fast enough. Did you get any kind of sense from your contacts in terms of whether the hydrogen component was window dressing or whether we are looking at a true shift to a new industry in Canada as part of this bigger energy transition?
Well, I would hazard to say that it's definitely short-term window dressing for sure. But with what's happened in Ukraine, it's basically an accelerator in terms of some of these green initiatives that basically most Western countries are looking to embrace. So think of it, I see it as a bit of a trigger point to have more serious discussions. But we won't be able to move on that immediately because there's going to take a significant effort just for Canada to go down that decarbonization path. And there's going to need to be even more renewable energy created if we want to be an energy exporter. So it's a bit of a double whammy on that front.
Well, and also is the investment climate in place for it, right? What do people think needs to happen to kind of lay the groundwork for that? Or does it all have to come from the government?
Well, what's interesting is, in some of the discussions basically had to do with the fact that no one's really going to invest in an LNG plant unless it be converted to a hydrogen plant in the future. That the numbers just don't add up. Governments, it doesn't really make sense for governments to expect that. I think one of the real discussions that needs to take place is that if Germany is looking to have Canada as an energy partner, it's going to have to put some money on the table. It's going to need, both countries are going to need an investment strategy and an infrastructure strategy on green energy, which is sadly lacking in both countries. There's a higher level of urgency in Germany because of what they're dealing now with their supply of LNG and energy and what they'll have to deal with in the fall. But I would say that we need an infrastructure investment strategy in Canada and Germany if this is going to be real. Because if not, who's going to invest in, for example, LNG, where the long-term horizon on that is not really that great?
You know a thing or two about public opinion. What does the Canadian public think about the energy transition, and how willing are Canadians to pay, I guess, to lower greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, if you'd asked me this question a year ago, or even before the pandemic, I would have said that Canadians are exceptionally ambitious when it comes to climate change, even if it costs jobs. But right now, we're in a period where Canadians are worried about the rising cost of goods, the rising cost of energy, the rising interest rates. They're worried about a potential recession. And as a result, I'll say climate ambition is still there in Canada, but it is not as strong as it has been before the pandemic. And I think we're going to have to wait to get through a period of the recession, but I'll say a little more stability before that really strong ambition returns.
You mentioned a bunch of stuff there. Focusing on inflation just for a second, what do the polls tell us about inflation expectations, and I guess the extent to which they're entrenched or not entrenched?
Well, a significant proportion of Canadians identify inflation as their top national unprompted issue of concern. But to put this into focus, about 28% of Canadians report that they're worried or somewhat worried about paying the rent or paying the mortgage, right? And for Canadians that might have a floating interest rate, it's even more crushing. So right now, the view is that interest rates and inflation are probably going to remain high, at least in the short term, with the hope that perhaps in 2023, things will stabilize a little more.
We can't talk about Canada's role in terms of global decarbonization without looking at the political backdrop, especially the federal backdrop. We have a new leader, obviously, for the federal Conservative Party. What are the implications of that for energy policy, do you think?
Well, think of it this way. The new leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, although he is an Ontario MP, which is in central Canada, a big part of his caucus is in the West, in the energy heartland of the country. So, for the Conservatives, I would expect under Pierre Poilievre basically to take a page out of previous Prime Minister Stephen Harper's book, where the Conservatives will want to craft a strategy where Canada is an energy superpower, where there's an orderly transition from carbon to less carbon intense alternatives, but that, what I'll say, the traditional kind of carbon intense energy sources are not thrown out the window, so to speak, in the short term. So think more long-term, more orderly, and a movement towards a less carbon intense kind of energy portfolio in Canada.
I think a lot of our viewers would be interested in your thoughts on just the stability of the Canadian Liberal government. What does the latest modeling suggest about how stable the federal government is right now under Justin Trudeau?
Well, if you're a Liberal strategist, the last thing you want right now is an election. And the latest, we do weekly tracking. We have the Conservatives at around 31% nationally, the Liberals at 28%, the New Democrats at 26%. But what's actually interesting is not just that the Liberals are behind, but that the NDP are up. What does that mean? That means that when we statistically model out an election, if it was held at this time, that the Liberal government would be seriously in jeopardy because of those vote splits of progressive voters between the New Democrats and the Liberals, allowing the Conservatives to pop up through the middle. So don't expect any kind of appetite for the Liberals for an election. That said, if you're a New Democrat, even though you're a parliamentary partner, you might be looking at maybe we do want an election because there could be a bit of a smash and grab for the New Democrats, as we've seen in the past under leaders like Jack Layton.
What are the, I guess, potential political landmines for Trudeau, and how do you see him responding to the pressure that you described? Is it more likely that he spends into some of this, or that he holds back?
Oh, he's going to spend.
Spend.
Spend, and spend more. He'll spend whatever's required in order to keep his parliamentary coalition alive. But the reality is that when we look at the environment, Canadians are pessimistic about the future. They're uncertain in the short term because of the recession. Interest rates are going up. We also have to remember that the housing prices in Canada are going down, and we haven't seen something like this in quite a long time. It's been a very frothy real estate market in Canada. So right now, it's a perfect storm for the opposition Conservatives and the opposition New Democrats. So count on the Liberals, by hook or by crook, staying alive and trying to stay in power until 2025 in order to go basically the full distance on the mandate.
I want to go back to something you said a second ago when you said, if I'd asked you a year ago how Canadians felt about the energy transition, your answer would have been slightly different than today because now they're more focused on inflation and some of the other issues. How unified are Canadians right now in terms of their priorities?
Well, it's interesting. Every week we ask what the top national issue of concern is. Usually there's one or two. In this particular environment, there are four things that Canadians are worried about, and it's a statistical tie between all four. And at the very top of the list is jobs in the economy, the environment, healthcare, and the rising cost of living. There's a narrative right now where Canadians are worried about climate change just because of the weather and other things that have happened over the last number of months. Also, emergency rooms have started to close in provinces right across the country. And right now, with the increase in interest rates, it's kind of like nothing's going right in Canada currently. And as a result, the electorate is a very grumpy mood, which speaks to the point that if you're the incumbent government and you have an electorate that's struggling to pay the bills, can't get into a hospital, is worried about climate change, they really have nothing to lose than to opt for another when they opt for another party. And I think that's why for the Liberals right now, they're probably just hoping that they can ride this storm out and hope for better days when they ask for another mandate.
And not all of that can be laid on the federal government's shoulders. Obviously, things like healthcare are provincial. Do you have a sense of whether that grumpiness that you're describing among the electorate, is it targeted more at the federal government or at a provincial level as well?
Well, it's targeted at both levels, but right now the Liberals have been in power since 2015. At some point, Canadians are going to say, "What have you accomplished? And is the country better off today than it was in 2015 when you first took office?" And for the Liberals on a lot of their big files, like the environment, like reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, they've talked the talk, they've put money in the window, but they haven't had the impact I think that they were hoping to have after being in power in 7 years. And if 2025 rolls around, that every government has a best before date. So it's not going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for the Liberals because they'll hit a best before date. There'll probably be a bit of fatigue, and they'll have to actually explain to Canadians why they deserve another mandate. That could be a very tough sell.
And from a policy front, I think you've probably touched on this a little bit, but what do you see as the most important issues that are kind of driving the policy agenda this fall?
Meat and potatoes. It'll be meat and potatoes issues. So, things like the environment, everybody says that the environment is important. But to my point, if you can't pay for the electricity bill, if you can't pay for the rent, that is much more immediate. So I would expect that not only the opposition parties, but the government will focus on helping Canadians get through this and to deal with immediate meat and potatoes issues like the economy and jobs, like inflation, like interest rates, like housing, in order to help Canadians get through this period.
And do you think that that holds true sort of beyond Canada as well? I mean, there's so much instability right now, so much market volatility, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not this is something that really forces progress on the environment or whether or not it actually slows it down, including a global energy crisis.
Well, I think there'll be no choice but to accelerate the transition to a less carbon intense economy. But the question is, what's going to be the strategy for economies to transition in an orderly way, and which does not leave a massive burden on consumers? Because when we look at the current environment, consumers are voters, and they're going to be looking for something orderly. So perhaps the key takeaway is that four governments, Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, that they need to set forth a plan, something that's an orderly plan that not just citizens, but that companies and enterprises can plan around and prepare for the future that we know is all coming.